while. Um, so I just did my proposal. So tell me what you think. It's a course that's different from what I usually do, which has a fairly tight sort of theme through it. This is a little bit more Catholic. I include globalization and how it has affected various things, notably radical Islam and Islamophobia, and also populism and nationalism. And so the seminar will be coherent because I'm going to try to show that these things are interrelated. But anyway, there should be something of interest for fall. Yeah, they wanted it. Do you know why they? So it takes that time. Well, I didn't mind, but it took me a bit of thinking because I don't like repeating. Because quite a few of you come to the cal. Right. Yeah, and I requested early afternoon because my understanding was that you guys like that. I'm really afraid that you're going to get so bored with me. So, well, anyway, I do try not to repeat. I mean, some of it because, well, because my field is international relations, so there's. Okay, are we going to have Hingham? Okay, we'll wait a minute. They do? Not gray? That's funny. Blonde. Never even was a blonde. In Latvian, I guess folklore. I mean, there are these two. I guess they were princesses. I don't know. And one had black hair, and she stood for Germany, and one was blonde, who stood for the wonderful Latvia. And so I had these dramatic ambitions. I think I was like 7 or 8, and I wrote and produced a play on these two, and I starred in it as the one with the black hair, the really evil. That was my idea of being heroic. I was twisted. Which is, you need to be twisted to deal with international relations today. It's not normal stuff. So you're actually calling them?
We're trying to connect to Hingham. They just have to reboot their router.
Okay, so we could wait another minute or so. It's 3, yeah. You wouldn't know why Hingham didn't give them the space last Wednesday. Do you know?
Is that why?
It was Hingham. Oh, okay. Okay. No, it wasn't me. No. No, it was them. A function. It's very nice. They asked me, do you remember when I did that course, fighting over World War One? So I did a talk for them. That was funny because I asked him, well, how many people do you expect? Because I was going to make copies of, and so he said, I think he said 30, and it was 100. That was, yeah, that whole room got totally filled up. No, probably not. No, it wasn't Ollie. It was the library. It was for, hmm? It was the library. Shall we start? All right. So what we're doing today is, how did I call Yeltsin years in East-West relations. And then I have a question. Integration into Europe? That was the question. So you have to think about the time 1990, 91, when the Soviet Union was breaking up. It was clear it was going to break up. It wasn't certain. Um, and after the coup against Gorbachev, it really became certain. Well, Yeltsin did something that Gorbachev never did. He stood for elections. Um, and Yeltsin was very popular, and he was viewed as a reformer, that he was going to go further and faster with perestroika, restructuring the economy, and democratize. Well, this meant that following the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a great deal of optimism about Russia, which was not well founded. Even at the time, it wasn't well founded. But the people around Yeltsin were those who supported democracy. And his foreign minister, Kozyrev, was, should I write that? Okay, no, I won't, because I don't know how to do it. Okay, it's, what am I not doing that I should be doing? Kozyrev was very pro-Western. Um, so even though being pro-Western is one thing, I mean, the West would like that, but it was more than that. It was that the people, the political elite at the time, were not only pro-Western, but they had a very serious interest in that pro-Westernism. And that was that they were concerned that the communists could come back to power. And how do you ensure that from happening? And they did two things. One was privatization, where they sold off pretty much everything at, I don't know, pennies per ruble, not even. This is where you have the origin of the oligarchs, because they were the ones who were smart and knew how to, well, including being crooked, because there were a lot of Ponzi schemes and all kinds of things going on. But the idea was you privatize, even if it's too fast, and if you're trying to sell off the assets of the country, you know you're not going to do well, right? I mean, that was a terrible way of doing it. But the idea was that then the communists cannot come back and scoop everything back up. So that logic is persuasive. And the other part of the people around Yeltsin was political democratization. So this is what Gorbachev called glasnost, but Yeltsin was going to go further with it. He was going to, there would be rule of law, there would be Western, well, more or less Western type of democracy. Now, there were those that even at the time were pushing back and trying to say that, well, Russia is different. We would have our own democracy. But be that as it may, the main point was that they wanted, Kozyrev, Yeltsin, people around them, they wanted to ensure that the communists could not come back, could not grab power again. And you want to remember that at that time, the communists were alive and well. They were there. They were a real possibility, let's put it this way. In retrospect, we see no, but at the time, that was something that the elites wanted insurance for. And so that pro-Western position served that. So it wasn't just that they wanted to become Westernized. Hello, Nina.
You wonder what her mental capacity.
Okay. Okay, glad to have you. Okay, so, and I just started, so. Now, the West, meantime, was not really looking very far into this. For one thing, nobody knew where to look. What Russia was not well understood even before. So, and there were these, as I said, misplaced hopes of faster and deeper.
Seeing it.
Do you think they can't hear me?
Why is it not? There it is.
Oh. Do you hear me?
Yep, I hear you.
Okay, good. All right. So, where was I?
Point of failure. Right here.
What'd you do? Just fiddle
All right.
with it?
So,
Just back in
this, as I say, the pro-Western thing.
So there's
But
our.
she's live streaming. It's not the Polycom working.
We're live at the Polycom, right?
What? All right, Yeltsin. The idea, and Kozyrev was particularly pronounced on this, integration into the West. And this was rather vague. It wasn't clear whether they knew what they meant by it, and certainly the West had no idea. So this was not really sort of picked up. What kind of integration? And it seems that Yeltsin and company had the idea that because they are democratizing, because they're doing these things, privatizing and so on, that the West would not only welcome them with open arms, but would help the project. And they needed help. The economy was in a terrible condition. Inflation skyrocketed. And so the people who were doing money exchanges, they would change back and forth between rubles and dollars. And they made fortunes as long as they kept guessing correctly. In any case, a very bad situation that Yeltsin, as Gorbachev had, looked to the West, look, we're good guys, help. And it didn't happen. So there were these conversations that, and there was some help, including from the United States. But in the United States, while there was a consensus about democratization being a good thing and Russia is, well, as it was perceived at the time, they're in a state of transition. Transition. So some of those books that I recommend to you, they really, she focuses on that, the transition. I think one of the books she titled something like Frozen in Transition. The transition never materialized. But, and so some today argue, was it because the West did not help sufficiently? Would it have been different if we had, I would think it would have gone down a rat hole. The corruption was so deep and pervasive that I think it wouldn't have made a difference. In any case, by the way, the ones they asked money from was the United States and Germany. And Germans let them down too, or they think they did. Well, the joining of institutions was particularly interesting because some of this was very complicated. The EU, it's not the United Nations where you say, we're sovereign, we want to join, and you're in. Well, there's a Security Council vote, and you're in. You don't have to sort of qualify. But the European institutions, you have to qualify. Well, there's one, the OSCE, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. OSCE, you don't. You join as you do the United Nations. But the other institutions, it was clear as soon as they began to make the moves of wanting to join, they were blocked. And so even, and this is kind of a good illustration, the Council of Europe, not to be confused with the European Council of the EU, the Council of Europe requires a qualification. Your country has to be not only independent, but it has to observe human rights and minority rights, because the council was established for the pursuit of human rights. After World War II, this was an important issue, and that was the idea, that you would have this institutional device for that. Well, the Russians were rightfully accused of committing mass atrocities in Chechnya, right? They were engaging in indiscriminate shelling, mass killing. So the council said, no. And this was particularly humiliating for Russia because they assumed that as soon as they, of course, they would get in. But what made it worse was that Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia got in ahead of them. And some diplomats later were telling me that that was what was the most bitter pill for the Russians, that they would get in first. And they actually lobbied to have their entry held up till Russia would get in. So they got in afterwards. They got in because they claimed that there was a ceasefire in Chechnya, and there actually wasn't. But it allowed the Europeans to shepherd them in. So that was a lesson of two things. One, how the Russians had no conception of what was really required of them to integrate with Europe. And Europe was not so keen on integrating. So while this idea was very popular in Russia, not just among the elites, but Europe at the time, from all of the former Soviet bloc and Soviet Union, Europe looked like the ticket to economic success and wealth and well-being and all that good stuff. Well, the disappointment came very soon. So the disappointment was dual. One, the Russians were deeply disappointed with the West. No help, no integration, none of what they were looking for. And Kozyrev made a famous speech at that time that was intended as a warning to the West. And his point was, if you don't allow us to integrate, it's going to be bad for everybody. It's going to be disaster. And you could argue, yeah, he was right or not. You know, you could argue over that. But in any case, what Yeltsin did, he changed his foreign minister. He appointed Primakov, who was not pro-Western. He was sort of middle, in the middle ground. Because, as I say, the disillusionment with how the West responded to Yeltsin was really drawing a lot of criticism on that pro-Western kind of orientation. So Primakov came in, and Kozyrev shortly after went to Florida. Why Florida? But anyway, huh? I never thought of that. Really? No, I've never been to Florida. I've never been. Well, the disillusionment on the part of the West was of a different kind, and that was that clearly Russia was not democratizing. And, you know, creating oligarchs is not economic liberalization. So everything was going south. That's why he went to Florida. Well, anyhow, it clearly was not going in the direction that the optimists in the West thought it would. The political reforms were short-circuited. The next time that Yeltsin stood for election, he was really elected by the oligarchs. They spent vast sums of money on campaigns that really shut out everybody else. And the election was reasonably clean, not as dirty as some following elections, but it was also bought. So that was certainly a disillusioning aspect of Russia in the West. And there wasn't any, or there were not any ideas that would sort of argue as to what should be done. What should the West do? How could the West encourage Russia to go in a different direction, etc.? It just didn't seem to be part of the agenda. What appeared clear was that Russia certainly would not be able to become a member of the EU or a member of NATO. During Kozyrev's time, that was actually broached as a possibility. By the way, even Putin has not said, oh, we would never. Instead, he said, well, they should invite us. Putin is not someone I understand. I don't know what he was thinking. In any case, let me describe in some detail of what it was that the West was thinking about. You know, if you had this disillusionment, well, why was it so profound? Although I should say that in, well, Germany, for example, the disillusionment was not really very profound until Crimea. So there continued to be this thinking that, you know, eventually it'll be okay. Putin is not a bad guy. Speaking of guys, I was just looking at an older account that I had of how this is an aside, how people in Europe, foreign ministers and such, responded when Trump was elected. They were all totally devastated. Well, they still are, but you're right. But it seems that not until Ukraine were they devastated with Putin, and they should have been, but, well, in any case. So what was there about the West? Well, point number one was, I quote, "We won the Cold War," unquote. There was a kind of celebration of a win and Russia as the defeated party. And that was picked up by the leadership. And there were some that, well, Republicans, and particularly Reagan supporters, were really, how should I say, well, savoring that. It was triumphalism is what it was. And that is always a pretty bad move in relations between countries. And it's interesting that Bush, the father, specifically cautioned people in the administration, et cetera, not to show a triumphalism. He understood. I miss the guy. He understood how corrosive that would be to the relationship. Well, others didn't see that. And certainly Reagan supporters continued to insist that, well, it was Reagan who destroyed the Soviet Union. No, I shouldn't put it that way. That he caused the collapse of the Soviet Union, that he caused the end of the Cold War. Historically, that is entirely false, but it was a narrative that was taken up by, well, Reagan supporters and many Republicans. So that was one sort of strand in Western thinking. The second strand was that there was an assumption that Russia indeed was in transition, that after all, from going from a communist regime to a non-communist political system requires a great deal of work. It requires time, it requires skills, political skills, and people are fond of saying how, well, the United States did not become a fuller democracy, and it is still moving towards that even today. And so, you know, give Russia a break. Well, right or wrong, but that was the thinking, that Russia is indeed in transition. And the third issue, this third problem, shall we say, was the lack of consensus on what the West should do. There was simply no consensus, either in the United States, and the United States did not actually pay much attention it wasn't as if there was no perception of an urgency. Maybe that's a way to put it. It wasn't a crisis, certainly, but there could have been a sense of urgency to sort the thing out, perhaps. But anyway, there was none. And there was also no consensus between the US on the one hand and Europe on the other. There were those in Europe who believed that the former communist states, none of them would be able to join the EU in less than 10 years, which they were proven wrong. But it reflects that skepticism about the ability of these regimes to transition from communism to democracy and market economy. And so there were those that thought that Russia would indeed take decades to do it. There were others who believed that it could be done in a much shorter time and that Europe needs to participate in the project. And that's when they decided that they would admit these candidate states to the EU and eventually to NATO. And there were two waves of large numbers of admission, and the biggest one was 2004. So the Baltic states joined the EU and NATO, but it was clear that Russia would not. And Russia, not only politically, but also economically, was not doing as well as the former Soviet bloc states, who were doing really quite well. Poland is a good example, not politically, because they're doing a lot of backsliding, but in terms of their economy, they did very well. And so this is also something that related to Ukraine, because the Ukrainians could point to their situation and that of Poland. Poland joined the EU and its economy did very well, and the two are seen as related. Ukraine did not join, and its economy has been doing very badly. So there's that. Now, what about the kinds of ideas and assumptions that the Russians were basing their approach to the West on? Well, as I already talked about Kozyrev, so he became foreign minister in 1990, before the Soviet Union broke up, but he was the foreign minister for Yeltsin in Russia. And by the way, Primakov came in 96, so it wasn't a, so Lavrov, who, well, there was one more foreign minister, and then Lavrov, the current foreign minister, who's had the longest tenure of them all. He lies so well. I think that, well, you know, of course, that that former spy and his daughter that were poisoned, it was the Brits that did it. You know that, right? See, I don't mind the lies so much, but I would love to know how they figure out how far, you know, how big a lie can it, because that's an extraordinary one. Yeah. Oh, well, anyway, that's Lavrov. But he speaks so fluently when he lies. If you lie, really big lies, you shouldn't stumble over them. So, and he doesn't. Well, in any case, so Kozyrev then committed to integration, and that was based on what some analysts have called the westernizers among the Russians, or Atlanticists. In other words, those who considered that Russia really, truly belonged to Europe, including the whole Atlantic region, and it's just a matter of the formalities and joining the institutions and so on. Well, the idea of the Atlanticists and the Westernizers really can be traced back to Peter the Great. Veliki.
Windows on the world.
Indeed. So Peter the Great was a Westernizer, but what today's Westernizers neglect to see, Peter wasn't into the institutions, the culture. None of that attracted him. He was concerned with one thing and one thing only, and that was building a powerful military, building a great infrastructure for that purpose, and that's what he was getting from the West. And it's those people that came to Moscow. Moscow had an area called really Germantown, Немецкий Sad, which, and by the way, Russians call foreigners, I don't know if they still do, but they used to call them Немцы, Germans. So whatever you were, Немцы. So that was associated, the Westerners. And they were brought to Moscow, and they lived in this really segregated community, and they were there for the building of a great Russia, not democratizing. There was none of that. So then Yeltsin's Westernizers, they had a different view. They focused more on the political and economic aspects than Peter. Well, so again, to just repeat that point, that the Westernization was very strongly linked to preventing the communists from regaining their power. Well, then when the West did not appear interested in this integration, Yeltsin removed Kozyrev. As I say, he replaced him with Primakov. Oh, and those of you who want useless facts, it was Igor Ivanov who was a foreign minister 98 to 04. We don't care. So 04 is when Lavrov came in. Well, Primakov was considered to be a centrist, and he also rejected the idea of integration with the West, rejected a pro-Western position. So it wasn't just having a different position, it was also really undermining the previous record. And notably, he rejected the idea of integrating with the West. You could say he was more realistic than Kozyrev. Now, the Primakov, as I say, centrist, but Ivanov, the sort of footnote of foreign ministers, he promoted the idea that Russia, and he did it explicitly, that Russia has to orient itself to the idea of a Russia as a great power. Because remember, at that time, Russia had not only lost the Cold War in the perception of some, but it clearly was not a superpower. And so then well, what was it? Was it even a great power any longer? And there were those who were very skeptical about it, particularly because of the terrible state of the economy, terrible state of the military. There was no money being spent on the military. It wasn't until Putin came in that they began to rebuild their military. And the military thought that Yeltsin was actually trying to destroy them for political reasons. So I don't know how substantiated that is, but that certainly was the thinking about some of the, among some of the military types. And following Primakov, who didn't do this so much, but now you have Moscow explicitly talking about a sphere of influence. So they're trying to assume that role of at least a regional power, right? And so they used words like, quote, special interest zone. As far as I know, because I've never found them using that expression that we use in the West, mainly for 19th century politics, sphere of influence. They don't use that, but special interest zone. So they made that claim, and Ivanov was the one very explicitly doing that. And they began to pay more attention to what they call areas bordering Russia, which is very vague. And for me, it's particularly significant because I do the research on the Baltic states. Well, the Baltic states border Russia. So are they including the Baltic states in this thinking or excluding them? And there was a high-ranking Russian officer at the Kennedy School doing this intimate little talk. There were very few people in the seminar, and he sort of tried to make a show of speaking very candidly and so on. So I asked him, do you consider the Baltics in your sphere of influence? And he never answered. You know, and I made the point that sometimes it appears as if they're excluded, but other times no, and he just wouldn't address it. So it's possible they themselves have not decided what to do with those pesky Baltics. So now there's a very important point here. Ivanov's term lapsed, that is, he was removed, and Lavrov put in his place at the time when the former Soviet bloc states and the Baltics joined the EU and NATO. That was a severe blow to Russian policies, and certainly their policies in the neighborhood, right? Because nothing would screech failure as loudly as these countries moving right out of that sphere of influence. So, Moscow is not a transparent kind of place. So, and I haven't seen research on this, how that played into Ivanov's removal. But in any case, that did come at around the same time. The next point, I think, well, the last point to make about what the ideas and assumptions were among Russians. It became clear to those who were trying to have a transition, who wanted to have a more democratic political system and so on, it became clear to them that that's not going to happen. And you had really a very significant shift among the elites. So you began with Kozyrev, you go to the middle ground of Primakov, and then you go to the great power sphere of influence, Ivanov, and then we come to Lavrov. And there had to be a rethinking about where they're going. But for Russians, how should I say? It was great pessimism. Maybe that's the way to say. Not in that concern about communists really no longer was the driving force. It didn't appear that communists could come back to power. But neither was democracy going to appear. And then to go ahead, when Putin came to power, when Yeltsin resigned, Putin basically made a bargain with the oligarchs. If you don't get involved in politics, I'm going to let you keep what you grabbed. And so most of them did not, but several did. And Putin went after them. So the oligarchs remained mainly, but not in power. But it also meant that the communists could not come back either. And with Putin in power, that also meant the communists are over. Although they still do okay in elections. I mean, better than Democrats. It's scary. Well, what you have is then a mutual disappointment, which by the time Putin came into office, you had a kind of context that was very, how should I say, permissive for Cold War relations. So now what I want to ask you is, what do you remember of that time when, I mean, did you experience that attitude of optimism about Russia? Because
yeah, you could see it happening. McDonald's was moving in, and all
oh,
that
good
stuff.
point. Right, McDonald's. Right.
Big companies in America were going over there, opening branches, and so you figured, well, it's only a matter of time. We'll all be the same, and we'll be going to Russia for vacation.
And a lot of people actually did, right?
But it's over.
How many people here how many of you have gone to Russia? That many. Wow. You should tell us, when did you go and what was it like when you went? When did you go?
I went in '92.
What was that like?
Well, everything was in disrepair and disintegration, and we didn't really mix with the people. It was Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the Golden Ring. So a lot of the towns that we visited, I felt as if we were back in the Middle Ages.
Why
But
did you?
and there was a McDonald's there at that point.
Yeah, in Moscow, yeah. Why did you not mix with the people? Were you sort of encouraged not to, or?
Well, I was part of a tour group. It was a British company, actually, but the tour guide was from Intourist, so he was Russian. And we didn't know the language.
Yeah.
So it was very early in the game.
Yeah, that was when optimism was pretty. When was that?
No, before the 90s. It was after Gorbachev took over, but it was before all the transition started. Things had quieted down.
Yeah. Well, actually,
It was one day in St. Petersburg, and the museums, the guys in the museum are women, and they had no stockings on, and all carried legs. And but that's all I can say was all these, and all I wanted to do was go get soap, give them soap.
Yeah, you could, that was,
Just wanted
Did they smell?
They were dirty, and they didn't let you touch anything. You could touch the walls, the paintings, everything. Nobody said don't. They made you put things on your feet. Those things you
I
put
had
on
no
those
idea,
booties,
yeah.
but they let you touch everything.
that sounds worse than when I was in Moscow.
And they had a place that you could go to change money if you wanted to buy it. And you got up to the window and you pulled the thing down. But they were through. You wanted to get any more money that day. So you didn't have any money, you couldn't buy anything. You know?
Tell them what they
It
told
was
you
scary.
when you go certain places.
Oh, yeah, we couldn't leave the group. I mean, it was good. And some people did go to Moscow. It was this, you could do it. I stayed right on the first ship. I was going to Moscow. And one guy came back and said it wasn't worth it. All he did was take his picture of his feet in Red Square to prove he had been there. But he said they just didn't have enough time. It was
Yeah.
one of those flights,
Yeah.
you know.
Well,
Russian
the
flights.
shortages were really
Oh, it was
extreme.
terrible.
Yeah, you couldn't get soap. You know, I went to do research in the archives in Riga,
Yeah.
and I don't know if I should talk about it. Well, let's put it this way. I had to bring my own toilet paper. You, well, you couldn't buy toilet paper, and so you could like cut up newspapers.
The river, it was filthy. The water, they do cruises on that river. I said, who are you doing? It was garbage and dirty.
Okay, who's been there more recently? So maybe was it
Never going back.
not? Well, it's not that bad now, I don't think.
I was there in 2014. I got a kick out of our tour guide. Part of it was in St. Petersburg, part in Moscow. So we had a tour down the river too. And the tour guide was giving us a sort of a overview of what we were going to do for a particular day. So she's talking, you know, on her microphone, and all of a sudden she said, "Uh-oh, KGB." Everybody brought it that. And then they sell T-shirts there, and I wish I bought one. I don't know why I didn't. White T-shirts, big black letters. KGB is watching you. That would have been so much fun to wear around here.
And where was that? In Moscow or
Yeah, in the big GUM, the department
GUM?
store.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we went there once and I saw them and I said, oh, we'll be back. But we never did get back, so I never bought one. But
And it wasn't dirty.
no, not at all.
Yeah. See, you were there at
It was the worst.
the
time.
worst. Yeah, they had enormous shortages, and I think I told you about. I like kefir, and so I would go to the store. This was the biggest store in Riga, and there's no kefir. And they tell, well, tomorrow, and I go tomorrow, no kefir. And finally, like third, fourth day, I finally asked, because I knew they had kefir. I knew they had a good dairy industry. So the story was this, that, okay, you have kefir, but you have to have the clean bottles to, and then you have to have a sober truck driver to deliver. So those things don't come together, therefore, no kefir.
What is kefir?
Kefir, it's sort of like a tastier yogurt that you can drink. It's not solid, or it's drinkable. It's delicious. No, it could be goat because it's a process. You can get yogurt that's goat. Delicious. My cat loves it. My cat has very recherche taste.
And I think the biggest problem was the fact that we couldn't move around on our own
When
because
was that? When were you there?
2011,
Oh,
and we had to have, if you wanted to go on your own, you needed a visa, your own visa. And we were on a ship, so we went on the ship's visa. And so we had to stay with the group. So we went to these gorgeous the palaces and the, you know, the Hermitage, and they were lovely, but the city looks so poor,
Really?
To
I'm
me.
surprised.
but very dreary.
You know, my husband and I stormed the Winter Palace. We had 2 bottles of Georgian wine, and then we stormed the palace.
I didn't catch if anybody in Hingham went to Russia.
How about it, Hingham? Did anybody go? Wow, quite a few of you. Do you have a story? Yeah? Is there a mic there that,
Yes, there's a mic.
Yeah, it's over there.
It's on so just talk loudly.
Oh, I went in late 90s as a leader.
could you speak up a little louder?
I went in the late 90s as a school teacher with a group of 7th and 8th graders.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh.
The first thing that set us off, when we arrived at the airport, we had been there 5 minutes and one of the kids lost their passport. And we were just reading our Russian guide at that point. He looked stricken. He knew what trouble it was going to be to get through the bureaucracy. And
You know, I think we're losing you. Could you get closer to the mic?
I could see the volume thing here, and it's way low, and I don't know if it's
Oh.
going in, but
Can you hear me now?
Yep, that's much better.
All right. So anyway, did you hear me say that we were at the airport 5 minutes and one of the kids' passports was stolen?
Oh,
And-
stolen.
Yes. One of the our Russian leader we had just met 2 minutes before, and he looked stricken because he knew he was going to have to handle it. Now, we were there 3 weeks, and he didn't get the passport for her until we were boarding to come back. It took that long, and he was very nervous about it the whole way. When we were there, we stayed in Moscow was our first trip, and the first thing we went was to the Kremlin, and it was so different. It was clean and spotless. The Gap was there. You know, that's where Stalin's tomb was, and that looked fine. But the streets, there was grass growing on the strip between the sidewalk and the streets. The streets had not been swept at all. Buildings were falling down where the Olympics before, where they were all falling down. And all the buildings needed painting. It was, but we got around in the golden ring, like someone else had said. But we ate in monasteries and all and got to know people in the villages. Oh, I did go. We always had a homestay. And I did go to a home of 2 teachers, and there was mother, 2 teachers, and their 2-year-old, and they had 2 rooms and a closet like for the kitchen for all of them. And we had dinner sitting on a couch, and the only way, I had taken 1 Russian course here in Hingham before, but I happened to take, knowing where I was going, they had a child, I took Richard Scarry's Busy People, if anyone remember that. And we could point to pictures in the book and understand each other. And we got along quite well that way. But I remember, I was going to say too, at that time they were having bread lines. All the little towns we went to around the countryside,
Really?
people were lined upside, like 2 blocks at the bakeries to get food.
That's surprising.
And one little town we stayed in.
Tell us again what year?
Late 90s.
Late 90s. Okay. Yeah, that's.
Yeah. So they were, yeah. nobody had a smile on their face.
Nobody.
Everybody was gray looking,
Yeah.
and nobody had a smile expression. You'd go up the street and pass all the bus stops and all and see the people. Nobody did. Oh, I took the kids out of the hotel one night in Moscow, and I said, let's walk down the street and see what it's like away from the hotel. It was a Saturday evening, like 5-ish. We went in. There were several Arabic stores, furniture stores with gold and glitz and fancy furniture, and then we went into a supermarket. I always like to go into supermarkets. And Friday night, there was nothing. Every
Late 90s.
meat chest, was empty, and almost nobody in there. And the old equipment, you know, the refrigerating equipment was so old, it was unbelievable.
And you have someone else in Hingham who went.
I have an interesting story. My father-in-law, I've been there, but my father-in-law's story is more interesting. And you may know of him. He went over in '93. He was on a Dartmouth cruise going down, I don't know, one of the Russian rivers, probably the Volga. And he had the idea, he's an entrepreneur, and he got in touch with the Russian church, the Orthodox church, because they're up in Kosovo, I think it was the name of the little town, and they sit on these awesome springs, you know, and he started a water company. He was one of the first Americans to go over there as an independent. He went by himself, got American
Kosovo
investors.
is not in Russia.
No, well, I'm not, Kostroma, I'm sorry, Kostroma. So anyway, yeah, Kosovo is not in Russia, Kostroma. So he got in business with the Russian Orthodox Church and started a water company called St. Springs, which people who've been over there, maybe you know, have had St. Springs water. That's my family, my father-in-law started this. So he did business over there, lived there, married a Russian woman for 10 years, and his descriptions were, you know, a lot of it was pretty grim, but it was also very scary because he got into business and he did very well. But he would start his car. He lived in Moscow, and he was afraid every day to start in his car there'd be a bomb in it. Also,
did he have to pay protection? Did he have to buy?
He probably did, because the apartment next to him did indeed, a bomb was put in front of it and went off.
That was the time, yeah.
Yeah, he was there as of the end of '93. He went over, and it was kind of a big deal here in America. Like there was a lot of newspaper press about him and that kind of stuff. Because
that was a time. That was a time that a lot of businesses went, and that was part of that optimism, and entirely unfounded. Well, that's very interesting.
Not for him. He made a fortune. I mean, and he just went by himself, got American investors, and that's the type of personality he is. But you know, now he's back here, obviously, into his 80s in America, and his wife is Russian, and she's here as well, obviously. And
so you have someone else that had a hand up. Yeah. Do you want to get to the mic?
Yes. It's right up here.
It's hard to see anyone in here. Well, they have the lights low so they could see the screen.
I can recount a more recent experience. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was at the Sochi Olympics in 2014.
Oh.
So I've seen a more recent situation in Russia. And although we have to remember that because it was the Olympics, it was kind of in a little bit of a bubble in the sense that it was an area that had been prepared for international visitors. But at that time, there were no obvious shortages. There were small I won't say mom and pop stores, because they were actually owned by various oligarchs, but they were managed by mom and pop, where you could go and get almost anything you wanted. I was actually working together with a staff of Russians in one of the Olympic villages, And we were able, as a result of that, to have access to any number of services. So uh, obviously, in a context like the Olympics, where there is an interest in showing a kind of Western equivalent facade, they were certainly able to do that. And previous to that, I had been also an exchange student at the University of Tomsk in Siberia and University of Rostov-na-Don. And at that time, that was in the period around 2012, 2011. At that time, my experience in those cities as well was that the government was beginning to use a lot of the oil revenue to overcome some of these situations to improve the conditions in the city. So I would say today, and obviously in the rural areas this may continue not to be true because many of the people are deserting the rural areas to come to the city. But certainly in the urban areas you can see, at least since 2011, 2012, that there has been an investment in the country to make, from a consumer point of view, things more available. And certainly for the Sochi Olympics, you would not know you weren't in another Western European country.
Yeah, they made an effort at that, yeah.
Right.
That's very interesting. What else have we got that's interesting?
That was great.
Oh.
We were there in 2016.
Oh, that's most
We were on a
recent.
cruise, off a cruise on St. Petersburg. And of course, you need a visa. You can't travel independently there. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to get a visa.
It is? Did
yeah,
you
the Russian
try
government
and you
has
couldn't?
to invite you. You can't just apply. You have to have a sponsor.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So when you get off the ship, the operator has a visa for everybody. The tour operator.
Yeah, the tour, yeah.
So we thought it looked fine.
It was beautiful.
It was
We were in a
beautiful.
tourist
We were in a
area.
tourist area. It was
St.
clean.
Petersburg. Tour director. She was a hoot.
Victoria.
She was so proud of her country. She had all these Americans and you know, Brits and everything. We were asking them all, well, what about this? Well, she was defending it. Putin, she loved Putin. He went to right here, St. Petersburg University. Putin goes there.
Yeah.
I go there. And I complimented her on her English. And I said, have you been to London? And she said, St. Petersburg University. She was saying things like, oh, you think that in the Cold War that when I was a kid we didn't have things. We had plenty of toys. She was very, very, I think she gets a lot of feedback from foreigners, but she couldn't say enough. And the parts we went to were incredible. They were fabulous. She took us in the subway. Oh my God, marble.
Yeah, they're very proud of this.
Yeah. Quite ornate.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
You're with your group. And
That is
she was our only
interesting.
exposure to Russian people.
She wanted the communists to come back.
She didn't like
She
Yeltsin.
She
did?
said yes.
She didn't like
Yeah.
Yeltsin.
Why?
She didn't.
Did
She
she
hated.
say?
She hated Yeltsin. She said Yeltsin gave the country away.
Well, yeah,
When,
he did.
as Kerry said, when she was young, they had all the toys they needed, and now you have to work so hard.
Oh, and a little jab. And we do not have homeless people.
Yeah.
They certainly do.
She was encouraging everybody to get on the internet and to get the Russian. She didn't call it propaganda, but to get the truth about Russia.
RTV.
Yeah.
RTV.
Russian TV.
Yeah.
That's the,
Yeah.
Now, somebody else on our boat that I was talking to, they had a different cruise, different tour. And he said their tour operator said the exact opposite. Hated the communists, said when the communists were there, if you were in a bus and you saw a line, you had to jump out of the bus and get in the line very quickly.
That's right.
That means they had something worth buying. And it
Right.
doesn't matter what it was.
That's right. Right. Yeah. And also, the system was corrupt, even at that level, at retail. And they even have a word for it, налево, on the left. And they have another word that goes with it, blat. And nobody knows what the heck that word is, but it refers to getting something through connections. So you had to cultivate people in a, I don't know, grocery, well, maybe not but say a bookstore. And I actually experienced that when I was there in 1990. And I was looking for a book that I knew was published on Riga's architecture. So I went into the bookstore, all 4 of them in Riga, or 5. No, we don't have it. And I said, but the book was published yesterday. I found out yesterday. No, we don't have it. Well, did you sell out? No particular answer. And then the faculty that I lectured for gave me as a present the book. And I said, how did you get it? And they told me, you cultivate the bookstore, the clerks or the manager, or who you get on blood. In other words, it's who you know, and then you owe them a favor, and that's how the system functions. So, I mean, think of living like that. And that really was that way everywhere. And so, yeah, if you saw a line, you would, and it didn't matter what it was because you could exchange it, right? You could exchange it. Yeah.
I know a contractor who got a permit within an hour, and they told him it's going to be 6 weeks. And he knows somebody.
Yeah, but it's not as pervasive.
No, not as pervasive.
No,
but
I mean, this was a constant part of your life, every part of your life. And, you know, the teacher who had how many people in 2 rooms? Well, those were called communalkas, you know, communalka, I don't know how to translate. But anyhow, what they were was, after the revolution, you had people flooding into Moscow, especially Moscow, but all the large cities, and apartments that had been a one-family apartment now had a family to every room. And they used the kitchen, and that's a communalka. All of them use the same kitchen and the same bathroom. Okay? That's what life was like, the typical life. And when I went to Riga, I saw both kinds. There was one, and he had to have major connections. They had this wonderful, spacious apartment. And then I was invited to one of the professors' homes. It was 1 room. That was it. And there was another one who said they would like to invite me, but they were ashamed because of how they lived. And this is, you know, 1990 already, and still the housing was that bad. Yeah, there are probably a few that would like communism to come back. Well, some of the older people, I think, would like it. For one thing, their pensions are awful, and so if you can't earn, and Russia is very ageist. I mean, somebody like me, they just put away in a room and lock the door. So very, very ageist. And I don't know if some of you who went there, if you noticed, and I don't know how pervasive that is today, but it used to be that in Russia, a woman was really looking and acting old when she was like in her 40s. People seem to age very early. I'm so glad I'm not there. What were you going to say?
So I was watching Morning Joe this week, and they had, I think, 3 of their correspondents who just come back from Russia, and they said it was a total looking-glass country because, like, they thought the poisoning had been done by the Brits, or it was a phony story. There'd be no chemical poisoning in Syria.
Right.
The airstrikes had been done by us maliciously for no reason at all. I mean,
everything that was
It
like,
was by the British. Lavrov said it was the British.
and everything was like a total reversal of,
Yeah.
you know, and everything about, we were trying to get, the FBI's trying to get rid of Trump and, you know, I mean, the whole thing, they said it was the weirdest thing. And they found everybody very apathetic. Even the millennials were like, eh. And it was really sad. But they were just so mind blown by hearing all the other sort of backwards news. Alternative facts.
Indeed. Well, you know, it's interesting that there are still free newspapers. You know, they can report whatever they want. Probably they would get whacked if they were very critical of Putin. And they have actually assassinated reporters. You know, Politkovskaya is the best known. She was murdered.
By being told to people, I just came across something on YouTube that I wasn't really aware of before. The guy was explaining that the Russians in Syria, and I didn't catch the whole thing about that, but he was saying that there's two oil pipelines going through Syria. One of them's a Sunni and one of them's a Shia. One's going from Qatar to Turkey, and he got the drawing of the pipeline, and he's saying this stuff about us being there for humanitarian reasons. And I listened to an independent reporter from Canada saying we're not there for humanitarian reasons. I saw like the same kid like months apart and all this, but no, it's about, well, I mean, it makes sense. We were in Iraq for OLLI.
But yeah, for a lie, but not for oil. I mean, we didn't even do the contracts. Some of them were gotten by China, and I forgot some of the others. So it really wasn't, it was really a set of other reasons, including creating a permanent presence for the United States in Iraq. So I think that we're in there for the oil or whatever. It's sort of the other kind of, it sounds credible. That's what a capitalist country would do, but it actually isn't like that. But for one thing, the oil companies are no longer, they're not the ones bringing up the oil anymore. You know, the whole industry has changed. So I don't know about that. I'd be a little skeptical.
At the beginning of the thing, I didn't catch it. I placed a double speed on it, so I listened to a lot of it. But Robert Kennedy was saying something at the beginning of his thing about, and then the guy went into about Syria, and it's not about the people, and then he starts forming a thing, starts showing a map of these two competing pipelines, and Russia wants one, and we want this other one going into Turkey, and
I don't know. I really don't know that.
It's either oil or gas.
See, the thing is, though, I want to remind you about my all-time favorite alternative fact, and I've told you this before, about the shooting down of the plane, right, in Ukraine?
Ukraine.
Yeah, remember that? So Russian TV actually showed, I don't know if I should repeat that, but do you remember that? They showed the two profiles of Putin's plane and the plane that was shot down, and they were, of course, similar. And so now they claim that, well, it was really an assassination attempt. But that wasn't the best one. The best one was that the people in that plane that came down, they were already dead. They were put on the plane as dead bodies in order to embarrass Russia. But it gets better. So where did they get the bodies? From the plane that disappeared. I mean, you can't do better than that. And that's really how it was broadcast.
Can you comment on the health plan in Russia during this time and also the scientific achievements?
What do I know about science?
No, but I'm saying it seems to be a moron that everything else seems to go on one way, you know, as far as their providing for the people, and yet their scientific achievement, at least what we see, seems to have been quite good.
Well, you're right. And there are other anomalies. I consider them anomalies. For example, education. So I know more about education than science. You realize that you're getting a very selective story. You're getting only what I know. So education. So they didn't have social science. They didn't have, they had scientific communism. But what they had that was superb was mathematics. Absolutely superb education in mathematics. And even now, I noticed that somebody told me there's a school, I think, in Brookline. Well, not a school, but that people have set up, Russian tutors doing math. I mean, they're known for that, but exceptionally good. But the rest of the education was horrible. On medical care, if you were in the party, you got really very good medical care. Otherwise, very poor. In the countryside, even worse. And they had a lot of what they call felchers, which is really kind of a registered nurse kind of level. And they were the ones that were providing most of health care. But the doctors were very good, and they were taking care of the party elite. The system was very differentiated. I mean, you didn't have sort of classes the way we think of them, but you had the party elites, and then you had the rest. And the division was so profound that even shopping, so there were stores that they had no signs on the doors, and but you could go in and buy pretty much any Western products, things that nobody could get outside. So it was there. They had it, you know, like they had the goods, and shortages didn't have to happen, and they could have had great education, and they certainly had great scientists. But it was sort of peculiar. Does that make sense? And they certainly didn't have anything. Look, we have something that's very influential and very, I think, supportive of democracy, and that's think tanks. There are those like the Hoover and the Hudson Institute that are very right-wing, and then you have very left-wing, and then you have Brookings that's sort of in the middle. And they're enormously important because we do have, they publish, they do research, they speak on issues. That didn't exist in Russia. And even today, civil society, because that's part of civil society, is not really well developed, or you could say not developed at all. So you have sort of well-known think tanks like Gorbachev's and Carnegie. There's Carnegie Moscow. Yeah, Carnegie Moscow. And I think that's maybe it. I'm not sure. But I'm glad you brought that up because it's much sort of, maybe it's easier, or maybe I'm just more knowledgeable about the major problems. They're so huge that maybe I neglect the pluses. They also have great recipe books. Just thought I'd tell you. I just came across one. Yeah. Well, the cuisine, Russian cooking, can be really wonderful. Yes.
Wow. Like what?
Pelmeni. They're sort of like dumplings, but no, not pierogi. Pierogi is they're baked or fried or whatever. Pelmeni are soft. They're like dumplings that are delicious. What else do you want to know? I think I've gone way off track. I don't know.
Now,
It sounds familiar.
fascinating. It's a novel, but it starts with Putin, his rise to power, and the oligarchs taking over. You know, all the oil industry and the news and the media and what have you. And then it goes on to coming to UK and the poisonings and all. And it's basically the story.
It's once
upon a time in Moscow.
And who wrote it? Was it a Russian or?
Remember the name? No, I don't think it was, but I don't know now. I can't remember. Very interesting, though.
By the way, speaking of books, on the oligarchs, there's a book, and I didn't put it on your list because I wasn't going to speak specifically about it, but it's Hoffman with 2 F's and I think 2 N's, and it's called Oligarchs, and it's a great read. It's just a great read, and he describes how the oligarchs did it. You know, there was a lot of very dirty dealing, and some of it was not so much dirty as using the system, because there were no laws. They didn't have the laws that you would need for a market economy. They just weren't there. So this meant that people could do, like, there were no laws that would relate to a Ponzi scheme. So people printed these things that said, you know, 1 share, but if you turned it over, it said not a share, it said you could use it maybe, and, you know, it was totally fake. But there were no laws to deal with it. Well, who would like the last word? Well, if I'm to do the last word, I think today's session, maybe you've introduced some themes that are worth thinking about, including that Russia very often is not what it appears, and we don't necessarily understand it very well. Definitely we don't, and certainly you didn't then either. And that was part of the difficulty in the relationship with Yeltsin. In a way, Putin clarified things, and we're going to deal with Putin next. He clarified things in that you could see Russia reverting in terms of international relations to reverting to what it was before, basically a Cold War. And that's a clarification, because in Yeltsin's time, there was no such clarity. We didn't understand what they needed or wanted, and they didn't understand what we were thinking, and just a mutual misunderstanding. Putin, I think, is much easier to understand. Don't you think? It's a... So what do we call it? Do we say that's ending on an optimistic note? Yeah.
Russia is a puzzle surrounded by mystery, wrapped in an enigma.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
It is still the same.
Well, yeah, I would say, because there's no such thing as leaking in Moscow. You know, they just don't. And they don't have Comey. Not even Stormy. See you next time, Hingham.
She's a character.
I know, it was good.
Yeah.